Thanks, Shahana, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final and I think most anticipated panel for the day, which is Government Enabling a Domestic Renewable Fuel Industry. So my name's Mike Hart. I'm the General Manager for Hydrogen and Next Generation Fuels at AMPOL. It's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panellists, and I am going to have to read out all those words on the page, just in case you're not sure who's who. So starting, this is in a different order, but I'm going to read from the top. We haven't seated everyone in order. But Mark Tierney from Queensland Department of State Development, Infrastructure, Local Government and Planning. James Boyle from Deloitte. Ben Vincent from Australian Government Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Communications and the Arts, who will be talking about the Australian Jet Zero Council and Aviation Green Paper. Ian Porter from Australian Government Department of Infrastructure, also Transport, Regional Development, Communication and the Arts, talking about progress on the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. Trent Colhagen from Australian Government Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. Alex Grant from ARENA, and Brigadier Gabrielle Follett making a return performance from Australian Government Department of Defence. So please, a big welcome to our panellists. Before I hand over to the presenters, I'd like to talk a little bit about what AMPOL's doing in this space. I don't have slides, by the way, so you're just going to have to bear with me. So at AMPOL, we're focused on supporting our customers through the energy transition by moving from traditional hydrocarbons to more sustainable forms of energy and achieving our net zero scope 1 and 2 ambition by 2040. Like you've heard over the whole day, we believe renewable fuels will play a key part of the transition for hard-to-abate sectors. And we also believe that we're uniquely placed to play a major role in the development of a renewable fuels industry. We're assessing numerous options for viability, including developing domestic production capacity. So last year, we announced 2 MOUs, one with the Queensland Government and another with Japan's leading downstream fuels company, ENEOS, to explore the production of renewable fuels at our Lytton refinery in Brisbane. The joint feasibility study, known as Brisbane Renewable Fuels Project, is assessing the viability of a world-scale renewable fuels manufacturing facility to generate SAF, renewable diesel, green naphtha and LPG alongside our operating refinery as a first step to building out a larger industry. Last year, we also kicked off a renewable diesel trial with a range of customers, including major construction company Hanson, to assist them with their decarbonisation journeys and to attain a practical understanding of using renewable diesel and its associated benefits. So in addition to our partnership with ENEOS, I'll just call out we're working with Qantas to explore delivering SAF to market, and Qantas is one of a number of companies we're working with as a key example of the important role that renewable fuels have to play in the energy transition. So to set up the panel discussion, I'll just list out some of the challenges that we see, and I'm sure they will do an admirable job of talking about them and potential solutions. In order to build a domestic renewable fuels industry here in Australia, first of all, we need to work together, and we've heard the word collaboration a number of times, in order to build a supportive policy regime. There are currently no federal incentives to process biofeedstocks domestically, and so as we all know, the majority of feedstocks are currently exported to international plants where incentives are in place. We consider that without either demand-side market signals, price certainty, or supply-side production incentives, the opportunity to establish a domestic renewable fuels industry will likely be missed. SAF mandates are being increasingly adopted in other markets, including Australia's Pacific neighbours such as Singapore and Japan, to give the industry clear demand certainty. And mandates in particular will support renewable fuels uptake by establishing structural demand and providing the certainty required for major projects like our project to reach FID. We will need similar policies in Australia if Australia wants to underpin a domestic manufacturing industry and to help ensure we're working to decarbonise our transport sectors. So where to next for Ampol? Despite the current policy uncertainty, we are forging ahead. Our BRF project is nearing the end of feasibility stage, with a decision to potentially move into pre-feed in the coming months. We're looking to work with state and federal governments to support policy development to underpin feedstock industries and a major manufacturing project such as Brisbane Renewable Fuels. And equally importantly, we're working to educate our customers, and again, we've heard that a number of times today. Education of customers and stakeholders is really important around the importance of renewable fuels to decarbonise the Australian transport fuels industry. So that's enough of me, and I would like to hand over to our first speaker, which I think is Mark Tierney. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you, Shahana, for your efforts to set up the conference this week. And thanks everyone for participating. I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered today. What I thought I would do is talk a little bit about what we are doing in Queensland to develop sustainable liquid fuels as an industry. In Queensland, we know we have a significant opportunity to establish the industry, and we've been working on this since 2016, when we released our Queensland Biofutures Industry Development 10-year roadmap and action plan. The roadmap has since been amplified by the Queensland New Industry Development Strategy, which was released in 2023. We are using some proven industry development expertise and channeling our efforts into supporting these types of critical industries that leverage Queensland's economic strengths, enable a decarbonised economy, and meet the demand for cleaner and greener fuels. Sustainable liquid fuels such as SAF and renewable diesel are an immediate pathway to decarbonisation, as you all know. To inform Queensland's actions, we have done a number of things. One last year was commissioning Deloitte to review international policy settings that have supported development of commercial scale SAF value chains across the world. This work highlighted potential policy and market settings for establishing the domestic value chain within Australia, and then also the roles that federal government, state government, industry and customers could play and will need to play in order to create this industry. The challenges have been very well articulated throughout the day, and I'm not going to repeat all of those. We do need to overcome them though. We know that a single policy will not create and support a SAF value chain. We will need a range of complementary policies that drive both supply and demand. You've already heard today different demand-side market mechanisms that are often talked about and debated. Targets, mandates, certification schemes, low emission standards. The federal government, we hope, can consider the pathway forward for those, because appropriately, those demand-side market mechanisms should occur at a national level. From a supply side perspective, I will talk a little bit more about what Queensland does in this regard, but we think about it in the context of establishing that refining capability, but then also creating the access to feedstock and expanding feedstock opportunities to be able to increase the economic opportunity for SAF and renewable diesel over the longer term. So in Queensland, we have strong agricultural industries and abundance of natural resources. We've got great scientists and a government that is committed to this industry. Developers of SAF and renewable diesel refineries are looking at the market and at Queensland right now, which is why we are supporting companies like Jet Zero Australia. I could also have talked about Ampol in this regard as well. The Jet Zero biorefinery is planned to start with production of more than 100 million litres of SAF and renewable diesel each year. You will have seen, I hope, that Jet Zero mentioned in the media recently and the execution of a licence and engineering agreement with LanzaJet, and I'm sure Jimmy's probably talked about that today. And then last week, they also announced investment into the project by one of Japan's largest energy groups, Idemitsu Kosan. These partnerships represent a significant step forward for Jet Zero's project, but also for development of SAF production in Australia. Many discussions in the last 12 months have ended with vehement agreement that somehow we need to start producing the first 1,000 litres. These first 1,000 litres are the hardest, but it's essential to demonstrate that it can be done. I highlight Jet Zero and also the likes of Ampol because these projects could be our nation's first 1,000 litres and then some. The world is moving very quickly to decarbonise, and doing small demonstrations with unproven technology is simply not going to build a SAF industry in Australia at the speed that is needed to be able to contribute and participate in the global economy. However, a small-scale commercial plant, circa 100 million litres, which is SAF but also renewable diesel, will provide the evidence that markets, investors and governments are looking for to de-risk the industry for investment and contribute to emission reduction targets. The Queensland Government continues to collaborate with industry partners. Mike, you've mentioned our MOU, which is a fantastic collaboration. We also have a collaboration through a Memorandum of Understanding with Qantas around how we go about developing the SAF industry. And we're also working with other proponents that we're not able to talk about just at the moment, but whose biorefinery projects are all starting to move forward through the planning phases. Feedstock is an absolutely crucial piece in the renewable fuels puzzle. While Queensland produces significant feedstock which is needed for renewable fuels, tallow, sugarcane and other cropping residues, there is also strong interest in alternative crops for future feedstock supply. Excuse me. It's abundantly clear from our proponents that unlocking access to feedstock for domestic use is paramount. In the years ahead, we need to ensure that feedstock is expanding to support demand for renewable fuels, and we also need to ensure that food crops which feed us and also help drive our economy are not disrupted. We are currently researching the volumes and types of feedstocks available in Queensland and working with CSIRO and universities to understand what needs to happen to unlock feedstock potential, support the growth of alternative or novel crops such as carinata and pongamia, and perhaps even in the future, the likes of algae. We are also establishing and fostering growth of supply chains to ensure that feedstock can be accessed by the fuel producers and that fuel can be stored and then distributed efficiently. The Queensland Government uses a range of levers. Apologies, losing my voice this afternoon. There's been a lot of talking today. So what I thought I would do here is just give you a brief outline on how the Queensland goes about working with proponents to develop large-scale projects and industries. So we have a number of levers at our disposal, and this is how we, as I said, contribute to these industries. We do use forms of targeted financial assistance. There are contributions to feasibility and FEED studies, as well as contributions to capital expenditure. One of the programs we use is the Industry Partnership Program. There are other government programs available for the right types of projects as well. One of the ways that we target that assistance is to deliver common use infrastructure. That can include shared roads, utilities or other services that don't just activate one site but can activate multiple sites. We also provide project facilitation services that assure interagency collaboration and assist proponents to navigate their approvals pathway. We do this by establishing joint project working groups with our key clients. We also contribute to social licence and building awareness and trust in the sector by promoting and contributing to demonstrations and trials, as we have already done over recent years at Brisbane Airport with Virgin and the use of SAF, with A&L shipping and a maritime fuel trial, with Lend-Lease on a couple of different trials at Caboolture Hospital and also a new performing arts venue. The other thing I will mention in the context of the levers that we use is the legislative and regulatory powers of the Coordinator General and Economic Development Queensland. Both of these organisations are unique to Queensland, and we're able to lever their powers and work together to help proponents move forward with the development, particularly when the developments are in state development areas, of which there are a number around the state, usually associated with deep export ports. A further commitment under the Queensland Energy and Jobs Plan that I would like to mention is the Sustainable Liquid Fuels Strategy, which aims to accelerate the uptake of these fuels in Queensland. Last year, the Queensland Department of Energy and Climate sought stakeholder input from fuel users, producers and sellers across many sectors. So the draft strategy is anticipated to be released for further consultation in the next couple of months. So thank you. I hope that has given you a pretty good idea of what the Queensland Government is doing in this space. You can imagine that's a surface level view of what we're doing. I could probably talk for a couple of hours on my own just about what's happening in Queensland. There are two key things I would like to leave you with. The opportunity for these large-scale renewable fuels projects is very live in Australia. We have more work to do from a policy perspective to be able to move them forward. And to make it happen, we do need to collaborate. Industry, customers, federal government and state governments all have a contribution to make to establish these new industries. Thanks very much.
Righto, 2 Queenslanders in one go. How lucky can you get? So I just want to, before we kick off, thank Shahana and Bioenergy Australia for inviting us to speak. So I'm James. I'm part of Deloitte's energy and climate practice here in Australia. We do a lot of work with both private clients in terms of developing up their particular commercial proposals, but also with policymakers thinking through the choices that the Australian economy faces over the next couple of decades as we look to decarbonise. What I'm keen to talk to you about, though, is we've been hearing lots and lots of things about all the policy actions that are needed to activate this market, how that's really, really important to deliver the decarbonisation that we need to be consistent with net zero, with our obligations under Paris. I think it's very easy, though, to point a lot of fingers and basically say, look, here's the policy toolkit we need, go ahead and do it, right? If it was that simple, it would have been solved, right? It's not, and there are very good reasons for that. So one thing that we have noticed is that there's a lot of inconsistency in terms of the policy asks of government as you move across different value chains, right? So whether that's, asks that the feedstock providers are making, whether that's, things that airlines are looking for, the technology providers, others, there's a lot of clarity that things are needed. It'd be great if there were interventions on both the supply side and the demand side, but specifically what is where there's a little bit more variegation, right? And while that's the case, while there is not consistency and clarity of the exact specific ask and the timing of those asks, it's a very difficult thing to solve through, right? You've got policymakers who are being asked to trade off interests between these different elements of the value chain, right? So individual asks, challenging. Bioenergy Australia has been doing some really, really interesting work in terms of trying to identify what that consistent view looks like. And that's what I want to take you through today. So last year, if he moves along, we got together a number of parties right across the value chain in the People's Republic of Queensland. Where else would you do this? So we had some of the airlines represented, we had some of the fuel producers represented, we had feedstock providers, we had a range of government departments there. And the question that we were trying to solve is, where is the inconsistency? Where are the disagreements or divergence in everyone's understanding of what needs to happen and over what time frame? And so we ran through a very painful, I'm sure those in the room would say, but nonetheless quite interesting process to understand where are the sticking points, right? Are there levels at which the industry can, universally, hand on heart, agree, right? Is that the aspiration in terms of what the objectives are, what can actually be achieved over different timeframes? Is that about the actual policy toolkit that needs to be used? Where are those points of disagreement? So, this is what we found. Maybe. So there's a lot of consistency when it comes to the specific outcomes, right? So those outcomes are effectively around a domestic SAF value chain. They are not exclusively decarbonisation. That's very important because it means you've got two metrics, not one. This is not exclusively about removing emissions from the economy. This is also an economic growth story, right? And working back, there's a lot of consensus that by about 2035, Australia could have a pretty material, pretty significant footprint, toehold in the global SAF market as a meaningful producer, and that would drive and deliver a whole lot of quite beneficial emissions reduction outcomes, both in Australia but also internationally. But you roll back from that, right? So you get to about 2030, what might that look like in practice? And there was some consensus that somewhere between 5 and 10% domestic SAF use, and that starts to look like somewhere between 2 and 4, small-scale commercial refineries. So if that's what we're solving for, what does that mean for the next couple of years? Where we got to is that means certainty, right? That doesn't mean necessarily a fully detailed, worked-through policy suite. It means enough market signals to provide the certainty that developers need for a facility to reach, that next stage of development, to move towards FID. So we found that very interesting, that there was actually a fair degree of consensus in terms of what we're solving for over what time frame. What there was much more discussion about was the barriers. And the relative importance of those barriers. They've been very well covered today. Don't think we need to delve into it too much, aside from to say there's a lot. It's really bloody complicated, right? If it wasn't, it would have been solved, right? But the big barriers that kept being drawn out were around the certainty over the revenues, the certainty over demand, whether or not the certification pathways are in place, feedstock availability, those sorts of things, very, very well traversed. But that really matters when you're starting to think through what is the right policy instrument to deploy to achieve that near-term objective we're talking about, which is effectively how do you provide enough certainty that investors can move forward with a particular proposition so that we can have the 2 to 4 facilities, so that we can have a thriving market by the mid-2030s. And the issue is this: there's a lot of stuff you can do, like a lot of stuff, right? And every institution has their own preference, right? And they have their own preference based on very, very well thought out, very logical views about what makes sense, right? And so those are things that can happen on the demand side. Is it a mandate? Is it a low carbon fuel standard? Is it defence, just buying all the fuel and kind of taking the cost gap and then, selling what isn't used? There's a lot of opinions about what can be done. Same on the supply side, right? There's recognition that cost premium exists. There are a range of ways that one could close that cost premium, right? All of which come with a question about who pays, right? But there's also other challenges. Mark, you spoke about the feedstock challenge and making sure that there's enough supply. Very important. There are a range of novel feedstocks that are being worked through. But again, choices there about the kind of development pathway that we want to be on. And then there's a range of enabling infrastructure that you actually need to book the emissions reduction, to actually draw value from it, to actually set up the architecture of a market, which is fundamentally what we're doing, right? And I think the challenge or the trap that we've fallen into to some extent is that everyone's playing for a market that doesn't exist yet, right? So everyone's got a whole lot of views about the right policy settings for a market that isn't quite there. So the challenge that we put to parties in the room is, if you had to put yourselves in government shoes, how would you start thinking about the choices? How would you start thinking about what can be done in the near term? It's maybe not a perfect solution, but it's enough to provide those signals to get those initial projects up and off the ground. And what we had to do was go, what are some of the trade-offs? What are some of the principles that if you were a policymaker having to face choices not just about decarbonisation in the aviation sector, not just about growth of liquid fuels, but cost of living, energy security, a range of different trade-offs, what have you got to think about? And you've got to think about a lot of things, right? But very briefly, you need to think about how some of these policy levers are going to deliver public value. Like, what's the actual economic dividend to Australia of these facilities? Is it exclusively jobs and growth, or is it more complicated than that? And I think we've seen a lot of articulation of those things at a very high level. We haven't necessarily seen the really rich, robust narratives that we have in some other sectors, right? So I think that's been a bit of a challenge here. And the data points that allow policymakers to trade off that very long list of different things they could do haven't been fully provided yet. That would be my view. Others will no doubt have their own. But what was interesting going through this process is we made everyone very laboriously go through and trade off these considerations for individual policy instruments. And where we came out was kind of interesting. We got 6 things, right? Can you do 6 things at once? Very good question. Don't know. Someone else's problem. But the 6 were reasonably consistent, right? And they were effectively about this catalysing force that we need in the short term, right? And they are about making sure that we have the investment certainty that is needed to make this possible, right? So I won't go through them in detail, but effectively on the supply side, probably something that looks like a revenue certainty measure, right? That's probably easiest to contract for difference. But also recognition that the pipeline isn't there. It needs to be developed, needs some development grants to actually build that pipeline out. There needs to be some kind of regulation on the demand side to ensure there's something there. The timing of that, I think, is a very big question, particularly given the cost of living pressures on governments. We need to have more rigorous sustainability standards and that clarity around feedstocks. Really encouraging to hear Queensland and CSIRO doing some very interesting work in that space. Trading mechanism around SAF credits, yay, great. And also some domestic awareness, to actually build that in there and make sure that there's confidence and trust in a market. We've seen from the ACCU market what happens when you don't get there. So, because I've had my first bell, I will go very quickly through this last bit. I want to challenge you guys, right? Because I think there are a few things that are missing, right? The first is consistency in terms of asks. The second is articulating that value proposition in a more complicated, more sophisticated, more integrated way. And the third is around those partnerships across the value chain, right? At the moment, there's a lot of conversations about individual projects, which is fantastic, but the way that the benefits are distributed across those value chains really, really matters. That is a conversation that needs to be brought together in a more integrated way. I'll call it there. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Ben Vincent from the Australian Government Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Communications and the Arts. I might start with a big thanks to Mike for the introduction and getting the title of the department right. Well done. And also to Shahana and Georgie for having me back. I was actually lucky enough to be a panel member at last year's Renewable Fuels Week, and I think at the time I remember joking that I'd been scheduled for just before the networking drinks, and I remember joking that the only thing standing between me and the audience, the only thing standing between the audience and drinks was me. A lot has happened since then. The better part of a year has passed, and from where I sit as a transport official, it's been a really busy, exciting year. We've seen, as folk have heard today, or will tomorrow, CSIRO and Boeing released a sustainable aviation fuel roadmap, which is a very good, very thorough analysis that found Australia is in prime position to produce and scale SAF feedstocks and contribute to a SAF industry in the Asia-Pacific region. And I believe Max from CSIRO is talking more about that tomorrow. ARENA's SAF initiative kicked off, and Alex will no doubt mention that shortly. The Roulettes used SAF in a public demonstration for the first time, which I suspect Brigadier Follett has already touched on today. The Australian Jet Zero Council has met a couple of times since last Renewable Fuels Week, and the Aviation Green Paper was released with consultation closing just before Christmas on 30 November. What hasn't changed since then, however, is that today, again, the only thing standing between you and that ice-cold drink at the end of formalities is still me and my colleagues and on this panel. And so with that in mind, I've promised Mike and Georgie I'll stick to time. And what I'll do quickly is give a brief update on the Australian Jet Zero Council and the Aviation Green and White Paper processes on foot at the moment. I'll start off with the Aviation Green Paper and the Aviation White Paper. Looking around the audience, I think a lot of folk here are probably well aware of the Aviation White Paper process. It will set the long-term policies to guide the next generation of growth and innovation in the aviation sector, and is examining the full range of issues across the aviation sector, including, importantly, how to maximise aviation's contribution to net zero. As the Minister said this morning, it is expected to be released mid-year, and it is being informed by feedback provided in response to the Aviation Green Paper. Again, those submissions on those closed on 30 November last year. Folk, I think, won't be surprised that the Green Paper had a fairly substantial chapter on decarbonising aviation. That chapter talked about the government's commitment to emissions reduction targets of 43% below 2005 levels by 2030, net zero emissions by 2050, the safeguard mechanism, and the opportunities and challenges that aviation faces in hitting jet zero. Things like efficiency gains, propulsion technology advancements such as hydrogen and electrification, the role of high-quality offsets, and the development and uptake of SAF, really importantly. And I know many here in the audience responded to our call for submissions to the Aviation Green Paper or attended roundtables or caught up with us directly. So I'd like to take the opportunity to personally thank you, those of you who have lodged a submission. It's really useful for us, so thank you very much. In terms of what we've heard through that consultation process, in response to that, released in September, we got about 2,000 submissions. A lot of them were from individuals, with about 200 submissions from organisations. Those submissions, if anyone's interested, are published in full on the department's website, and unless the authors have asked us not to. And you can, if you're interested, you're more than welcome to get online and have a look at what folk have said. But in terms of sort of what you'll see if you do that, not surprisingly, amongst other matters, the department received a lot of feedback that sustainable aviation fuel is likely to do the lion's share of emissions reduction for the current fleet of long and medium haul jet aircraft out to 2050, and strong feedback from on the advantages of getting a local industry stood up, with contributors talking about decarbonising aviation, the potential for generating new jobs and industries, supporting liquid fuel security, the types of themes that have come up today and indeed on this panel. So where next? The government's released the Green Paper. It has received a lot of feedback. Government's working through that feedback, and the Aviation White Paper, which will set out those long-term policies, is due to be released mid this year. So stay tuned. I'm wary of the bell. I probably don't have a lot of time left, so I'll very quickly talk about the Jet Zero Council. Along with processes like the Aviation White Paper, the Jet Zero Council represents one of the ways in which the government has committed to working with the sector to support the reduction of Australia's emissions while growing jobs. The council membership was announced last year, and it's met twice over since the last Renewable Fuels week, once in August in Brisbane and once in December in Western Sydney, and it will meet next in April in Melbourne. It brings together a small cross-section of stakeholders from across the aviation sector and its supply chains to work more broadly with industry to provide advice on how to encourage emissions reduction in the aviation industry, provide senior industry leadership and promote, mobilise and galvanise industry efforts to decarbonise aviation. In terms of sort of where it's going, the council has published a work plan which it settled in at its second meeting, and that work plan's available on the department's website if you're interested in looking at it. And it has a focus on things like, not surprisingly given some of the conversations that we've had already, establishing the building blocks, so the architecture of an Australian SAF market through advice on the development of arrangements for SAF certification to provide assurance of environmental credentials and provenance, building SAF literacy and social licence, developing advice on how the benefits of SAF can be best accounted for, advice on options for things like national frameworks for voluntary consumer purchasing of SAF, advice on policy frameworks, and identifying changes required to airport operations and infrastructure that will support decarbonising aviation. And again, in the 10 minutes I've got, I probably can't go into much detail, but plenty of extra information available on our website. I am fearful of the bell, so I'll move to summing up. What I'll say is that from my perspective as a transport official, since last Renewable Fuels Week, it has been a very busy, very exciting space to be in. There's been sort of in this part of the ecosystem I occupy, a significant consultation process on the Aviation Green Paper, which government's working through at the moment. The Australian Jet Zero Council is cracking through a work plan. The Aviation White Paper is due for release in the middle of this year. What hasn't changed, though, is that the only thing standing between you and that ice-cold drink at the end of the day is me and my colleagues, and I'm about to get the bell, so I will drop it there and say thank you very much.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and apologies for the flood of Australian government bureaucrats coming to the stand. My name's Ian Porter. I'm going to talk to you today about the government's overarching net zero transport and infrastructure roadmap, which Minister Catherine King spoke about this morning. Can I start, of course, though, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on whom we meet today to talk. Pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to thank very much Shahana and Bioenergy Australia for the opportunity to speak today. I'm talking to you at the point, that always charming point in the Westminster system where we're still developing advice for government. So I don't have a product to put in front of you, so I'll be far less interesting and exciting than my good friend Ben Vincent. Thank you, Ben. But I will talk to you about some of the things we've been thinking about in the sectors that you represent and around transport decarbonisation more fully. And I'll flag the likely timing and process around our transport roadmap and how you can get involved in that. Now this little green button, I think, is my friend. Is it good? Always good practice to say what you're going to cover in a talk. Today I'll talk about liquid fuels and the transport sector. I will reduce the amount of words I say to each of my slides because I have heard some extraordinary discussions today in the SAF sessions and the renewable diesel sessions, and I don't think this audience needs a lecture from me on how that industry is progressing and how those technologies are going to use low carbon liquid fuels. But I will show you the slides that I intended to show you nonetheless. I'll talk about heavy road and rail freight a bit. I'll talk about maritime. I will skip over aviation, as Ben has covered that so well, and then talk a little bit about some of the thinking that's in our heads around a domestic low-carbon liquid fuel industry. But frankly, some of the conversations I've had about industry needs today have gone beyond already where we're up to. Then I'll talk about the transport sector decarbonisation plan. I should start, of course, by just noting that the Australian government, in fact successive Australian governments, have committed to net zero by 2050. And the current government has committed to a 43% reduction against 2005 emissions by 2030, as the Minister noted this morning. And I think the term she used was within striking distance of those targets. I was giving a talk some time ago and David Spears was the moderator. I recommend that as a fairly terrifying experience if you ever want to do that. And I said, foolishly, we are within cooey of the 43%. And he said, is that an official government term, Ian? Striking distance sounds much better, and I'll stick with the Minister's language going forwards. At the same time, the government will need to put together and present its 2035 targets for our commitments under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That will be done late this year, early next year, and those targets will depend on a whole range of issues, of course, as you can imagine. So the discussion and the debate on those will go forward now. So liquid fuel use, if we're going to meet our... Actually, sorry, I had one other thing I thought I'd mention, and that was just a reflection that transport is now around 20% of our greenhouse gas emissions in Australia. And by 2030, if transport stays on the trajectory it's on, and electricity stays on and gas stay on the trajectory they're on, transport may well be the highest emitting source in Australia, which is an extraordinary question to be posing to ourselves. For those who've worked in decarbonisation for any length of time, electricity and gas have been the major issues in this country for so long that the thought that we would move to being more worried about transport in decarbonisation is, to me, quite astounding. Liquid fuel use in the transport sector, for us to meet our decarbonisation objectives, we really need to effectively find solutions to drastically reduce our reliance on fossil liquid fuels. That reliance is largely driven, these are old figures, but the sense or the broad direction of them is still right. Transport is the vast bulk of our liquid fuel use, around 80% in this chart. Until low emissions technologies materialise and become more available to us in terms of electrification, in terms of hydrogen, as we've heard all morning, low carbon liquid fuels provide potentially a drop-in solution which also will meet the need of many of the industries represented in this room. So that's the challenge that we face ourselves. Heavy road and rail freight will undoubtedly rely on liquid fuels for some time to come. I have a lot of words here I'm not going to use. I'm just going to note, as per the slide here, road vehicles generate a very, very significant proportion of our transport emissions. In fact, road emissions are up around the 70 or 80% of our emissions overall, depending on what year you look at. In terms of freight, while rail covers more than half of our freight movement, it is considerably smaller as a percentage of our emissions. It is naturally a less emitting sector. So that needs to play out to some extent in our conversation around freight. The distances that our road freight vehicles in particular travel will also necessitate liquid fuels going forward. One of the comments I've made quite a few times in public fora is that there are some transport modes where it is already absolutely or abundantly clear where the majority of decarbonisation will occur. And if you think about light vehicles, so passenger transport, light commercial vehicles, electrification will play probably the biggest part in decarbonisation. That doesn't mean there won't be other solutions. Hydrogen could well play a part, efficiency of existing vehicles, and hybrids will still have a part to play for quite some years to come. And there will be a market in light commercials and potentially some passenger vehicles for low carbon liquid fuels. But electrification is the main game, if you want to look at it that way. At the other end of the spectrum, long haul aviation, the only solution we can really see in the short term is SAF. There will be parts of the aviation sector, I assume, Ben, sorry to step into your space, but there will be parts where electrification may play a part and hydrogen may play a part at some stage. But SAF is the main game there. And then there's quite a few sectors like heavy vehicles and heavy road and rail freight where it is not yet clear where the bulk of the decarbonisation will come from. So some of it will come from electrification, no doubt, some will come from hydrogen, and some, a lot, will come from low carbon liquid fuels. And it may be that those all play out in one marketplace where the technologies, the ingenuity, the innovation that people in this room bring to the table determines what the outcome looks like, or it may be that subsector by subsector it'll be quite different. It may be that lighter heavy vehicles in cities may well electrify, but long haul vehicles may look much more at low carbon liquid fuels. Very much an open question, very much one where any solutions government eventually brings to the table will need to be, will need to offer room for innovation and for different parts of the market to operate effectively. In the maritime sector, and I'm glad we are talking about this because there was a very sensible and reasonable plea for us not to forget the maritime sector, it plays a hugely important role in the movement of goods in our economy. Ships transport over 99% of our international trade by weight and 87% by value, according to the figures I've got in front of me. It's a hard-to-abate sector. I notice everyone's using that terminology here. I think at some stage we may need a different terminology because I think every sector we haven't debated is now going to be a hard-to-abate sector. Hard to electrify might be an easier one to use, but maritime is certainly a hard-to-abate sector. It's unlikely to electrify. Domestic maritime emissions account for approximately 2% of transport emissions. Our share of global sea freight is around 14%, but ships carrying our sea freight, irrespective of flag, only contribute about 4% of global international shipping CO2 emissions. The majority of maritime vessels, I am led to understand, do not refuel in Australia, meaning that interoperability for fuels will be crucial due to the nature of international supply chains of liquid fuels. Vessels travelling into Australia may have future demand and emissions implications. To decarbonise this sector, hydrogen-derived low and zero carbon fuels such as green hydrogen, green ammonia and methanol, as well as low carbon liquid fuels more generally, are very much going to be needed. The government is acting through the Maritime Emissions Reduction National Action Plan, which is one of my favourite acronyms that I've ever struck, the MRNAP. The MRNAP will set the strategic direction and recommend actions to decarbonise our maritime transport sector, as well as contribute towards reducing international shipping emissions. The plan, which will meet part of... Was that my bell? Goodness me. So, we won't talk much more about the MRNAP. Apologies to those working on it. Aviation, Ben has covered, so in fact the tense has changed here. We'll explore. What I'd like to do is move to talk a bit about a domestic low-carbon liquid fuel industry. And there are people here who are starting to do the real work to make that industry happen. But here are a few maps, I love a good map, which start to tell us a bit of the story about how that might all come together. And what I've got here on the top left-hand side is from CSIRO's 2023 work, feedstock availability by state and territory. Oilseeds, carbohydrates, residues, waste and power to liquids. On the top right-hand side from the MRNAP issues paper is an indication of the locations of maritime alternative energy sources of supply. Similar sorts of questions in terms of biofuels and so forth. And then down the bottom is a picture of our national key freight routes. Overlaying these starts to tell us a bit of the story at a more granular level of how an industry is going to need to develop, whether that's production, distribution use, refuelling, supply. This is the sort of work that we're going to have to think about in the years to come. So, what is the Net Zero Transport and Infrastructure Roadmap and Action Plan? This piece of work was announced by Minister Catherine King quite some months ago. It's a clear strategy, or it intends to be a clear strategy and picture of how we will reduce emissions across the transport sector and across transport infrastructure. I mentioned before that governments have committed to net zero by 2050 and that the current government is working on a whole range of future policy questions including what our 2035 target might look like. In doing that, we've also established or identified 6 sectoral plans that will be developed, so the bottom-up hard work from government departments around where abatement is going to come from and what it might look like. And those will be transport, which is our roadmap, electricity and energy, which is an important one, which will speak to the work we're doing because it will see our colleagues in DQ looking at low-carbon fuels and questions like that. Industry, resources, built environment, agriculture and land, very importantly, because it'll address or help us address questions around feedstock and the like. And of course, as I mentioned, transport. So the Transport Sector Plan, or Transport and Infrastructure Net Zero Roadmap, the eventual form it takes is a decision for government, of course. We're providing advice to ministers, but the way we've conceptualised it is to start by thinking about the 2 key transport tasks, movement of people, movement of freight. Then we've thought about what the decarbonisation pathways most likely will look like, and I've given you a bit of a sense of that in each transport mode. And then we've thought about the cross-cutting issues that will either tie together those modes or that emerge from consideration of them, such as transport infrastructure, decarbonisation of our electricity grid, and low-carbon liquid fuels, crucially. Infrastructure is a very important one. I could talk a lot about that, but I won't. The amount of carbon that is embodied in our roads and rail infrastructure is important, and it's immense, and we need to start making decisions on long-lived infrastructure that maximise the decarbonisation of that infrastructure while at the same time delivering it in a way that is sensible for the Australian community. Very, very difficult questions. The other thing, of course, is there's linkages that you sometimes don't initially pick up. Very close now. Heavy vehicles, as they become either hydrogen or electrified, become heavier. The front axle mass goes up, as many of you will know, and that has an impact on road pavements. States and territories maintain those roads, and they become very quick to come and talk to the Commonwealth about some issues that might emerge in that space. The first stage is our consultation roadmap. That is, I would say, weeks rather than months away, but again, that's a decision for government. Once we put that out, we will do a couple of months of consultation and we'll speak to anyone in this room or otherwise, and the offer is on the table for us to run sessions for groups of organisations and industries, so we'll be available in whatever form you need for those 2 months to help understand what's in the roadmap. The last version I saw is 100 pages, so it's a substantial piece to work through. When it comes out in its final form, it will contain with it at least the first round of government actions to try and take us along that roadmap. The version that comes out now is more of a technology roadmap and green paper. The final version will have more of a statement of how government plans to bring life to it all. Having said that, we will need policy iterations on this for some years to come. I think I've said all that, so thank you very much, colleagues, for listening, and I look forward to the discussion at the end of the session. Thank you.
Hello everyone, hang in there, we're almost there. I promise I'll keep to time and do a good job. If I yell, it's because it works well with my kids getting their attention. If I'm quick, it's just because I'm a bit excited. I will say I am working on reducing barriers to renewable diesel, the renewable diesel market in Australia. Yeah. But firstly, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we are gathered today and recognise their ongoing connection to the land, waters and culture of Australia. Okay, my name is Trent. I'm a director of the fuel quality team at what we commonly call DQ, because we have a very long name as well. And the fuel quality team sits within the liquid fuels branch. So the liquid fuels branch leads the government's work on Australia's fuel security, building fuel reserves, maintaining domestic refining capacity, but it's also implemented measures to increase the security of Australia's diesel exhaust fluid supply, as you might remember, over the last couple of years. So we have quite a diverse mix. Of course, from a fuel quality perspective, we've done lots on petrol standards to enable Euro 6D standards in recent times that you would have seen announced. But importantly, we're also working on the energy transition and as it relates to the supply of liquid fuels. So sort of different from the transport side, we're the fuel side in particular, and the policy lead on low carbon liquid fuels. Go back already. So very quickly, a lot of this has been said, but I will just reiterate so you know we understand liquid fuels play a key role in the Australian economy. I'm going to concentrate on diesel today, and particularly renewable diesel. Now, 40% of all diesel was for non-transport purposes last year. So that's something that's significant and something we need to consider. And that includes, as you can see in the diagram, you know, agriculture, mining, manufacturing, but also stationary energy as well. And so there's you know, a lot of work happening around new technologies, electrification, hydrogen, and so forth. But we are hearing, obviously, that renewable diesel and biofuels got a significant role to play. So for us, that messy middle period is going to be really important around the most diverse range of fuels, you know, we've probably ever seen being used at the one time. And for us, still having a real role around fuel security and especially liquid fuel security during that time. I'll probably skip through this one to make sure we get to the more juicy stuff, but of course we've been seeing an increased interest in renewable diesel. It's easy for us to sort of say now, oh, well, you know, why haven't we done a lot of this a long time ago? A couple of years ago we weren't really seeing anything at our end, but in the last 18 months there's been a lot. I've had a lot of conversations with Shahana, I've had a lot of conversations with many of you in the room. So where I come in is the Fuel Quality Standards Act regulates the supply of automotive fuels, but that automotive fuel goes into non-road as well. So what we don't regulate through this act is aviation fuel or marine-specific fuels. Now, renewable diesel, as most know, it's a type of paraffinic diesel made exclusively from biogenic feedstocks, but the density of renewable diesel does not meet our mineral diesel standard in Australia. I think most people are familiar with that, but it's a key reason that there's a barrier to supply here at the moment as far as the fuel standards go. So a European paraffinic diesel standard has been in place since 2016. In America, they don't have the density requirement that sort of Europe and others, including ourselves, have in our mineral diesel standard, so it's a little bit easier for them. And I will say from a fuel standard perspective, I came into this a few years ago thinking, global fuel standards, it's all going to be the same. And my Bible on fuel standards is big and varied. And there are so many different specs, you know, often based on refineries and those sort of things in countries, different chemicals used. It's, as always, you scratch the surface and there's a lot to uncover. So luckily what we do have within our Act is the ability for us through the Minister to vary a fuel standard on a temporary basis. And so that's what we've done over the last 12 months. And so you heard from Taku today around Cleanaway and, you know, sourced through Viva. We've had Ampol and Hansen, we've had BP, and we've had Lendlease with MAR Consulting as well. And so all of those all of those users have been allowed through this variation. That variation is a relatively straightforward process. It is a process, it's free, and so I would say to anyone that has the interest in the supply of renewable diesel prior to a fuel standard being in place, you should come and talk to us. It's not that difficult. We will assist you with that process. There are some in place already. You're not doing anything we haven't seen before, and so there is no reason for you not to come and talk to us around supplying renewable diesel. What I will say is if you're supplying renewable diesel in Australia at the moment in a neat form and you don't have what we call a variation, you definitely need to come to us because you're supplying non-compliant fuel. Not that anyone here would be doing that, of course. So, recent government actions. As we've heard again from Taku, the NGAS scheme has been amended mid-last year to include new fuel types, and renewable diesel is one of those. We've just heard from Ian around the sector decarbonisation plans. Now, also worth noting, the electricity and energy plan was released Friday, as we've heard earlier. That is another important plan that involves renewable fuels, and so I would strongly encourage anyone interested in that to have a look at it and provide a submission. It is definitely the point now at which if you want to influence these things, this is where you get involved. This is where the rubber hits the road. Terrible pun there, but this is where you get involved and not just talk about it, is these types of plans. And of course, we recently produced the consultation paper on establishing the paraffinic diesel standard in Australia. We were originally going to do this more just at a technical level. It's mostly a technical exercise, but we felt there was enough interest in it from users and others that we should put that out. We got a really strong reaction, a really positive reaction from all involved. So we'll move on to what we're doing there now. Okay, so a paraffinic diesel standard in Australia would allow renewable diesel to be sold without any bureaucratic practices, any administration before you have to sell it, before you supply it. Just a reminder, the Fuel Quality Standards Act is around the supply of fuel. So what it would do is ensure consistent quality of the final product for users. So as someone that works on fuel quality, we walk the tightrope between enabling maximum supply of a product and ensuring that vehicle operators, consumers, the vehicle industry has a confidence in being able to use that fuel and have optimum performance. That is something that we have to consider all of those angles too. Of course, it would remove a key barrier to supply, provide certainty for suppliers around what they can supply from a renewable diesel perspective, and provide a market signal to increase uptake, albeit small. You know, this is one small part of the bigger picture. What it wouldn't do is impose any sort of mandates. It's about the quality of the fuel. It wouldn't provide a market incentive. We understand that. And just importantly for us to note, the fuel quality standard does not impose your traceability, guarantee of origin, or any of that angle around life cycle emissions reduction. That is a big and complex piece of work that is outside of what the standards do. When we test fuels, we test for the end product, and is that meeting the specs required from that product? So just a few quick things we're looking at. Of course, density is a key consideration, and it's the real difference in the final products around mineral diesel and renewable. Flashpoint, which is I think been mentioned a couple of times already. The EU paraffinic diesel has a flashpoint lower than Australia's. That's to match the mineral diesel flashpoint, so we expect we can find a way through that. And I should have said, for lack of time, we are looking to align with Europe as closely as possible, but there are always a couple of things that could impact supply here in Australia, or could impact vehicle operability and things like that. So we're always looking at these things. Blends can get complicated because as soon as you put mineral diesel into paraffinic diesel, it's not it doesn't meet the paraffinic diesel standard anymore. So that's something we need to work through. And information standards. So when you go under the minimum density that's in the mineral diesel standard, we expect there will need to be some sort of information provided. All right, almost there. So consultation on our work was closed on 2nd of February. We're happy to hear from anyone, anytime. Anyone that's spoken to us before will tell you we are happy to take the time to talk to you in more detail about this or take on new information. We're in the process of developing that draft standard now. We have a fuel standard consultative committee, which is sort of legislated through Act, that every fuel standard goes through. And so we are hoping at this stage that we can provide a full a full standard which includes testing methods and the full shebang to the government to be considered by the end of the year, which is pretty aggressive timing for a fuel standard, but we think there's the general goodwill around renewable diesel in Australia and its closeness to mineral diesel means we think we're well on the way to getting that done. All right, thank you everyone, that's it.
Okay, looks like I'm going slideless. Perfect, thank you. So firstly, this is the first time I've been invited back to Bioenergy Australia to speak, so in 6 years, at a similar session. So firstly, thank you to Sian and the team. Looking around, it's a fuller crowd and arguably a better looking crowd, so thank you for staying. And I hope to have something to come back to you in before 2030. So my name is Alex Grant. I'm a director in the Business Development Transactions team at ARENA, which is the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. I look after our efforts to decarbonise transport. I'm very pleased to be here today to share some insights from the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Funding Initiative. So before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I think we can all appreciate that the First Nations people around the country are critical to our energy transition. So, just while I wait for the slides to change, many of you here will be intimately aware of ARENA, and I usually say that we tend to be one of the federal government's best kept secrets, but noting the ARENA name has been splashed across a couple of presentations today, we're in the crosshairs, so always good to be noted. As a refresher, we're an independent federal government agency, and we're tasked with supporting the global transition to net zero emissions by accelerating the pace of pre-commercial innovation to the benefit of Australia. And we do that by two main functions. The first is the provision of grant funding. And as you can see here, since inception in 2012, we've provided over $2.4 billion in grant funding to almost 700 projects, unlocking almost $11 billion of support. So this grant funding is one key piece that unlocks projects that are trying to progress the innovative elements of our economy and help them on the path to commercialisation. The second function where ARENA helps is on knowledge sharing, and that's asking proponents to develop and disseminate the information they produce from their projects, the good and the bad, and share that with the industry so that everyone can be upskilled and learn from these early adopters. You'll note in the top left corner too that ARENA's provided over $130 billion to the bioenergy sector over the decade, and that's gone across biomethane projects, renewable diesel and energy from waste. So turning now to the aviation sector, what is ARENA doing to help the sector to decarbonise? Pleased to report that last year we launched the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Funding Initiative, and this was a program that has a $30 million envelope tasked with unlocking the production capacity of SAF in Australia in a domestic setting. Now, it was opened last July and is closed to applications in November, and we're currently working through the application process there. So I'll be tempered in what I am able to say on that process. That said, pleased to report that we had over 20 high quality applications presented to us, and I look forward to having more to say on the matter as the year progresses. So today, I guess I'd like to share some of the themes that have emerged from the early stages of our assessment. And this is not a technical discussion today. We've heard some wonderful presentations on the matter. This is more a case of arena interplaying between what does government consider and what do investors consider before putting at-risk venture capital into the space. The first theme is that sustainability is paramount. How sustainable is SAF? And that has two facets. The first is focusing on the fuel, and a number of parties have provided exhaustive evidence both on the calculations and the evidence to show what the carbon intensity of these pieces are and start to tell the story of what that decarbonisation role is. I think the other piece, which is equally critical and it's been mentioned today, is the messaging of this to stakeholders, to the public, just to make sure that there's buy-in, that SAF truly is that critical piece of the aviation puzzle. And secondly, in terms of sustainability, the actual projects themselves have a lot of work to do to demonstrate that there's a clear pathway to having a sustainable operations. And no different to other renewable energy developments around the country, there are concerns around the land use, approvals, interactions with both traditional and non-traditional energy stakeholders, and how do you ensure that this is all pulled together in a way that there's strong and enduring social licence to operate. The classic example is talking about feedstock, and not only what's required to get a project to final investment decision through that minimum contracted standard, but if this is a wild success and if that latent demand does start to pull through, is there that capacity in a region to unlock additional feedstock? Second theme I'd like to touch on is just to recognise this is a nascent sector. Not looking to dampen the enthusiasm today and the momentum, but there's a lot of work to do. And we've been very pleased, and my team and I have a wonderful role in that we get to receive the insights from the industry as to where they're at with their journey. We've been fortunate to invite around 10 parties to progress through to full application, to really to do the homework, and that's to progress beyond concepts, beyond pre-feasibility work into feasibility and front-end engineering design. It's critical that we can give these parties the time, the space and the support to develop a pipeline of projects. Not all of these will convert, and to ensure that we have diversity around production pathways, regions, and otherwise, just to ensure that there's a sufficient pipeline, so at the time when institutional capital is ready and when the policy mechanisms are aligned, that we have a good quality set of assets ready to support. And the last theme, and Mark, you touched on it earlier, is cooperation. No one party will have all the skill sets required. However, it's the groups that start to bring along a coalition of the willing to ensure that the skills, the work, both on the due diligence and then the buy-in from key stakeholders, is brought along so that each party can increasingly ratchet up its confidence. Starting to echo myself, but to do the work is to prove to yourselves that the particular projects that they're assessing have a clear pathway. We believe in the capability of the teams, and that's as you increasingly bring those parties along the journey, that momentum builds itself, and one project getting away is wonderful. A number of these around the country means that further support is compelling. So, finishing before the bell, that infamous bell, but would love to stick around and talk to anyone who's keen to talk about either ARENA generally, our efforts to decarbonise transport, or otherwise what I can about the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Funding Initiative. Thank you.
Hello again. Thank you for allowing me to speak a second time today, this time more broadly on how we're going to transition the ADF capabilities to a future energy mix. As introduced this morning, in fact, no, let me edit all of that because we all want to get out for hydrogen haircuts and biomethane burgers. What I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about is the strategic imperatives, opportunities and considerations for the transition of military capabilities to clean energy. These factors have informed the development of a future energy strategy that we hope to have finalised and publicly released before the end of this month. The astute among you will notice that the end of this month is not far away, so that is obviously a thing that we are trying to get over the line very quickly. I'm therefore going to be giving you a bit of a sneak peek into what we believe that strategy is going to entail when it is announced. The context, or the why, that forms the basis of this strategy is important. Climate change and the resultant environmental impacts threaten to degrade national security in multiple ways, including growing disruptions to our critical infrastructure, increased displacement of people in our region, and growing demands for our Defence Force to respond to humanitarian and environmental disasters. And we see this today in the Northern Territory with Cyclone Megan. Moreover, a climate-induced reduction in human security in our region could increase the risk of political instability in states with weak institutions and may enable malign actors to use coercive means to capitalise on the growing needs of those states. Concurrently, Defence holds an obligation to contribute to global efforts to reduce carbon emissions and to mitigate climate change. We want and we need to do this for environmental reasons and for the security reasons that I just outlined, and also because we depend upon our social licence to be effective in our mission, including our ability to recruit and retain our people in an increasingly competitive employment market. Alongside climate threats to regional stability and national security, climate change and global responses to it bring other imperatives for Defence to transition away from the energy types that we currently use to power our operational capabilities. Over the next couple of decades, we expect fossil fuels to reduce in availability and increase in cost, requiring Defence to transition our energy types simply to maintain capability. Given that we depend upon a resilient energy supply to sustain Defence operations, this is another key driver for our transition to sustainable fuels. Adapting to new energy types carries significant opportunities for Defence capability and for national security. The Australian fuel market substantially relies upon imports from countries in the South China Sea, including Malaysia, Singapore and Japan, which I know you're all aware of. And as you already appreciate, in a potential conflict situation, these routes may be disrupted. Independent of climate change, fuel and energy security are critical requirements for our national resilience. In this light, new renewable fuels present a potential opportunity for a domestic energy industry that enhances our national resilience and our national security. We could improve our energy independence as a nation and our resilience through a diversified onshore supply of renewable fuels. In doing so, we would reduce or even potentially eliminate the vulnerability of our position as a fossil fuel importing nation. This could greatly improve the environmental and logistics sustainability of our military capabilities. It's getting slower as the day goes on. So over time, Defence needs to transition away from the fossil-based energy types that are currently powering our operational capabilities. As I mentioned this morning, as an outcome of the Defence Strategic Review, we have been directed to accelerate our transition to clean energy. And this is across the operational fuels, the liquid fuels that I'm talking about this morning, and also in a separate part of Defence, work on the Defence estate and bringing that across to renewable energy types as well. To ensure this transition to lower carbon intensity fuels for our military capabilities occurs in a programmatic manner that manages risk, we are currently finalising a future energy strategy for Defence. Our primary challenge in setting this strategy is how to adapt to new energies while maintaining our operational capability and our preparedness as a military force. We cannot afford to compromise the ability of our Defence Force to achieve our primary mission in a time of increasing geopolitical instability. In adopting new low-carbon fuels, we must manage our future energy mix such that it is sustainable, both logistically and environmentally, and effective for operations that are in austere and threatened environments, particularly in the north of Australia. If we overly complicate our supply chain within defence that provides these fuels, if we introduce onerous storage or distribution requirements, or adopt too many and varied types of future energies, the effectiveness of the fuel network that enables the projection and sustains the employment of our defence capabilities, particularly in those austere environments that are remote, that will be compromised. Furthermore, maintaining interoperability with our allies and partners has never been more important. Compatibility of our operational energy types with those of our allies and our regional partners is a key element of this, and ideally this interoperability can be increased. And by that I mean militaries have long spoken about having what we would call a single battlefield fuel. Potentially in this transition, if we can collaborate not only with industry but also with our partners across the world, we might actually attain that objective. Finally, as the Defence Strategic Review makes clear, collaboration with industry is key for both the current and future fuels that make ADF operations possible. Once finalised and released, our strategy and our subsequent implementation plan will provide a framework that guides the transition of military capabilities to future energy types. This is critical for defence, for ensuring that defence takes full opportunities that are available to us in this transition, including the opportunity to collaborate with military allies and industry partners regarding the adoption of these alternative energy types and maintaining interoperability, enabling sovereign alternative energy production capabilities, thus strengthening national energy security, maximising value for money by transitioning from increasingly expensive fossil fuels to the future alternatives in the longer term, and linking alternative energy adoption to the system that procures new or replacement defence capabilities, so those tanks, planes, ships and all the other capabilities that go together to make a defence capability. We need to make sure that that procurement process is dovetailing and is synchronised with the transition to future energies, so that we don't end up with an offset between the platforms that we are operating, what they need to power them, and what is truly available in the emerging renewables market. This strategy, once released, will be necessarily broad and will be the first step in enabling the decisions that will govern and cohere Defence's transition to renewable fuels. This strategy is likely to be delivered through 5 lines of effort, as shown on the slide, with further detail to follow in an implementation plan or a more detailed roadmap. Each line of effort is planned to include initiatives that Defence will need to undertake in collaboration with other parts of government, industry and partner militaries. This slide highlights some of the actions that have already commenced under each line of effort. The Sustainable Aviation Fuel demonstration that I spoke to this morning was a significant milestone for Defence, primarily to give confidence and to build experience. In addition to this, we have also just established a nascent Defence Energy Transition Office. It's small, it's only 2 people. In fact, the entire office is here today, walking among you. But once that's mature, it will improve our ability to engage with industry and to coordinate more effectively across Defence and whole of government. Although in its infancy, this office will become a central hub that affords greater visibility of what is occurring across Defence in areas such as policy influence, internal defence policy, research and development, market scanning and other planning functions relating to demand and supply. So we will be more able to clearly set our agenda out in the public domain and communicate it more effectively with you. Hopefully some of you have been able to connect with those from that office that are here today. The ADF is very much at the start of our journey and in transitioning to renewable energies. This journey carries significant opportunities to improve the resilience of security in our region. Once finalised and released, and I'm very hopeful that that finalisation and release is truly imminent, our future energy strategy will guide and cohere this transition so that these opportunities are realised and climate mitigation efforts are met without compromising operational capability or preparedness for potential conflict. Thank you for listening a second time. I think I've got us back on track, and I look forward to any questions if we have time.
Well, thanks to our panel, and I've got some fortunate and unfortunate news. The fortunate news for the panel is that we're out of time, so you're going to get let off the hook for Q&As. Unfortunate for our audience, who probably had some insightful questions testing questions for you. But no, just a big round of applause. Wonderful presentations. Thank you very much.